The man on the gurney had 30 seconds left to live. His abdomen was split open, blood sheeting across the trauma bay floor in waves so dark they looked black under the fluorescent lights. 4 doctors stood frozen. The attending surgeon shouted conflicting orders. Monitors screamed, and in the middle of all of it, a quiet blonde nurse nobody had ever paid much attention to, pushed through the crowd, pressed 2 fingers into the wound without gloves, and said 2 words that silenced the entire room. Everyone, move. What happened in the next 4 minutes would change everything for her and for the people who destroyed her life. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind we tell on this channel. Real tension, real stakes, and endings that nobody sees coming. Hit the like button if you want more, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Hargrove Medical Center had seen its share of bad nights. Situated on the south edge of Caldwell, Ohio, a mid-sized Rust Belt city, still trying to decide what it wanted to be, the hospital took everything the region threw at it: industrial accidents, overdoses, the occasional farm equipment injury that nobody in the city had a reference point for. The trauma bay on level 2 had absorbed enough blood over the years that the staff stopped flinching at the sight of it. New residents still flinched. The experienced ones had simply learned to redirect the flinch into motion, into action, into the specific tunnel vision of people who had trained themselves to function in rooms where the margin between living and dying measured itself in seconds. Tonight, that margin was thinner than most. The paramedics came through the bay doors at a dead run, gurney wheels shrieking against the linoleum, and what they brought with them made the charge nurse step back without meaning to. The man on the stretcher was enormous, 6'2", maybe more, the kind of build that suggested years of doing things that required exactly that kind of body. Combat dense? A trauma surgeon had once described that physique. Not gym muscle, working muscle. The kind layered on through repetition and necessity rather than vanity. But size meant nothing when your abdomen was torn open from hip to navel and your blood pressure was sitting at 61 over nothing. GSW to the abdomen. Penetrating, suspected aortic involvement. The lead paramedic rattled off, barely keeping pace with the gurney. His voice was professional and flat. The cadence of someone who had learned to strip emotion from words because emotion cost time. BP cratered en route. We pushed 2 liters of saline. Got nothing back. Patient has been unresponsive for 4 minutes. No ID on him. Came in as a John Doe. Bystander called it in from the parking structure on Fennell Street. The trauma team converged around the gurney in the practiced choreography of people who had done this many times. Gloves snapping, equipment rolling. The overhead lights in Trauma Bay 2 were the harsh, unsparing kind. They revealed everything, including the degree to which this man was in trouble, which was considerable. Dr. Leonard Foss reached the bedside first, already pulling on gloves as he assessed. Foss was 53, department chief, a technically skilled surgeon who had over the years accumulated a reputation that was simultaneously deserved and slightly inflated, deserved in the operating room, inflated everywhere else. He had a framed profile from a regional medical journal hanging in his office, and his residents had a private nickname for it that nobody said out loud where he could hear. He was not a bad surgeon. He was also not a man who responded with particular grace to chaos he hadn't personally organized or to the presence of variables he hadn't anticipated. Type and cross. Call the or. I want 2 units of O-neg running immediately, he said, leaning over the patient with the portable ultrasound probe. Get me a central line kit and push the cart closer. No, the other cart with the thoracotomy tray. I want it in reach, even if we don't use it. The resident closest to him, Dr. Kwame Osei, was 2 months into his surgical rotation and still in that phase where his competence and his anxiety were running neck and neck on most nights. Tonight, anxiety was pulling ahead. He wheeled the ultrasound to bedside and watched Foss press the probe against the patient's torso. The image on the portable screen was not encouraging. Free fluid everywhere, the black shadows of blood pooling in spaces it had no business occupying. The abdomen was a disaster internally, bleeding from somewhere fast and significant. "He's exsanguinating," Foss said, as much to himself as to the room. "Free fluid throughout all quadrants. We need to move him upstairs." "His pressure won't survive transport," Osi said. He said it carefully, like someone testing the weight of ice. "St1 systolic, with 2 liters on board. If we move him now, without some kind of hemorrhage control, he codes in the elevator." "I'm aware of what happens when you move a patient with no pressure," Foss said. Not cruelly, but with the exhausted precision of a man who needed people to trust that he was managing the situation. "We're not going to stand here and watch him bleed out. Get OR2 on the phone, tell them we're coming in 5 minutes. It was at that precise moment, not before, not after. Not after, as though she had been calculating exactly when the situation reached the point of no return that a woman stepped through the outer ring of the trauma team. She moved without announcement. No raised hand, no raised voice, no performance of urgency. Just a quiet, lateral step through a gap between 2 residents, and then she was at the bedside, and she was looking at the wound in a way that was distinctly different from how everyone else in the room was looking at it. They were looking at the scope of it, the volume of blood, the challenge. She was looking at the wound itself, reading it, almost her eyes tracking left to right along the entry and exit characteristics with a focused, sequential precision that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with analysis. Her name badge read Nora Walshern. She was 31 years old, average height with pale blonde hair, pulled back in a tight, practical bun, and a face that was by design or by nature the kind of face you did not immediately remember. She had worked overnight trauma shifts at Hargrove Medical Center for 14 months. She was considered reliable, quiet, and good with difficult family members. Nobody had ever paid much attention to her beyond that. She tilted her head slightly, looking at the wound. Then she said, "Dr. Foss." Her voice was quiet. Not tentative, just calibrated for exactly the volume required to be heard without performing. "Not now," Foss said, without looking at her. "The bleed isn't diffuse," she said. "It looks diffuse on the ultrasound, but it isn't. The primary source is focal upper left quadrant, proximal to the iliac. The free fluid is tracking from a single arterial point, not from generalized tissue damage." Foss looked up then, briefly, with the particular expression of a person exercising patience they feel they shouldn't need to exercise. "Nurse Walsh, I need you on IV access. That's where I need you right now." Nora didn't move. The monitor issued a sound sustained, low, and alarming. The patient's pressure dropped again. 47 over nothing. The room shifted into a faster gear, someone calling numbers, someone else pushing epinephrine through the IV line. "Doctor." Osi pressing his hands into the wound, packing with the helpless urgency of someone doing something, because standing still was unbearable. "He's going to arrest in under 2 minutes, Nora said. Her voice had not changed. Not louder, not tighter, not faster. The steadiness of it was, in its own way, more alarming than shouting would have been. The packing is not addressing the source. Volume replacement is not addressing the source. You have a high-velocity arterial injury to the proximal left iliac, and it is not going to respond to pressure or fluids. And you know this how? Foss said, and there was a sharpness in it now, the edge of a man whose authority was being questioned in front of his team. "Because I can feel where the pressure differential is," she said. "And I know what a partial iliac transection presents like." He stopped. Started again. "That's not something a nurse determines by feel." "I know that," she said. "Give me a Foley catheter, the largest bore you have, and a 60 cc syringe in 2 minutes, and this man has a chance. Don't give them to me, and you're writing a death certificate in about 90 seconds. Stop. The room went very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a decision is being made that everyone present understands is real. Foss stared at her. His jaw worked once, and in that moment the monitor above the bed began a sustained, flat tone that was not a warning. It was an arrival. The patient was coding. "Starting compressions, doctor," Osi said and moved. "Stop," Nora said. Everyone stopped. "Compressions will accelerate the hemorrhage," she said. "Give me the catheter." Foss looked at the monitor, looked at the wound, looked at this woman he had dismissed 30 seconds ago, who was standing with her gloved hands at her sides and her pale, gray eyes fixed on him with the absolute, unperformative calm of someone who had been in worse rooms than this and had not lost. "Give it to her," he said. It came out like it cost him something real. Someone thrust the materials into Nora's hands. She didn't fumble, didn't pause, didn't ask for anything to be repositioned or re-explained. She moved to the wound with the economy of motion that belongs to people for whom a skill has been practiced so many thousands of times that thought and action have merged into a single fluid thing. What she did next was not in any standard nursing curriculum. It was barely in any standard surgical curriculum for civilian practitioners. She threaded the catheter into the wound cavity, navigating entirely by tactile feedback, no imaging, no guidance wire, no verbal instructions from a senior physician. Her fingers moved with a specificity that was almost mathematical, finding landmarks by touch, reading tissue resistance, the way experienced hands read the road through a steering wheel. She inflated the balloon at a location that should, by all reasonable civilian medical logic, have been unreachable without direct visualization. The monitor did not change immediately. 6 seconds. 8 seconds. 10. The room did not breathe. Then the pressure trace began to return. It came back in increments, slow at first, then steadier, 41, 54, 62. Dr. Osi made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a word, not quite anything with a name, just the involuntary exhale of someone watching something impossible become possible. 71, 78, 83. Nora stepped back from the gurney. She stripped the outer gloves in 2 practiced motions and dropped them in the biohazard bin. She looked at Foss, and her expression was not triumphant, and it was not relieved. It was simply factual. "The balloon is buying you time, not fixing the injury," she said. "He needs the iliac addressed surgically within the next 20 minutes, or the temporary occlusion fails. You can move him now. Pressure should hold for transport if you go immediately." Nobody spoke for a moment. The monitor beeped steadily. 86 over 50. "Not good, but not nothing. Get him upstairs," Foss said, and his voice had a texture to it that it hadn't had before. Something stripped out of it now. "Move." The team mobilized. The gurney began moving. And in the organized chaos of a trauma team doing what trauma teams do when they finally have a direction, no one was looking at the nurse who had made it possible. Nora watched them go. Then she turned back to the supply cart and began restocking what had been used. The surgery lasted 3 hours and 50 minutes. Nora spent that time doing the work that was on her assignment board, post-op monitoring in room 214, a medication reconciliation on level 3, a long and patient phone call with the adult daughter of a cardiac patient who needed someone to explain, in plain language and without condescension, what an ejection fraction was and why it mattered. Nora was good at that. She made people feel that their confusion was reasonable, that their questions deserved real answers. At 3:20 a.m., she was in the break room with a coffee that had gone cold when Dr. Osi appeared in the doorway. He was still in scrub cap, post-op, and he had the look of someone who had processed a difficult thing and arrived at the far shore of it, still not entirely sure what he'd crossed. "He made it," Osi said. "The patient. They got the iliac repaired. He's in recovery, and his pressure is holding." "Good," Nora said. Osi came into the room and sat across from her without being invited, which was either bravery or obliviousness. He was 26 and still believed that direct questions deserved direct answers, which was an admirable quality that clinical medicine would eventually complicate for him. "What you did in there," he started. "I assisted in a trauma resuscitation," Nora said, "given the deteriorating situation and available resources." "That's not—" He stopped. "Tried again. That technique. The balloon occlusion manual without imaging. I looked it up after. I couldn't find it in any civilian literature, any peer-reviewed, publicly accessible literature. There's a lot of medical literature." "Nora." He leaned forward slightly. "Where did you learn that?" She looked at him for a moment with those steady gray eyes. "Journal reading," she said. "Continuing education." "Good night, Dr. Osi." He left. She sat alone with her cold coffee for 11 minutes, listening to the ordinary sounds of the hospital doing its overnight work. Then she rinsed her cup, set it in the rack, and went back to her rounds. She had almost gotten away with it before. Smaller interventions, carefully calibrated, a drug interaction, caught and flagged, a diagnosis nudged in the right direction, a sepsis presentation identified 6 hours before the lab work confirmed it. 14 months of being slightly better than the situation required, but never so much a better that it became a story anyone needed to tell. The trick was in the margin. Stay just inside the line of explainable. Let the outcomes speak without letting the method become visible. But the trauma bay at Hargrove Medical Center had 4 ceiling-mounted cameras. 2 of them fed directly into the hospital's liability documentation server, which ran automatic cloud uploads every 2 hours as a safeguard against equipment failure or tampering. It was a system that the administration was proud of and that nobody on the clinical staff ever thought about. The overnight security supervisor thought about it at 6:15 a.m. He watched the trauma bay footage from the 11:47 arrival once, then backed it up and watched it again, and then called not the hospital administrator, but a number saved in his phone under a first name's Nemta, only the kind of contact that certain people in certain positions accumulated over years for exactly this kind of moment. The supervisor had been in the Army before this job. He had seen medical training. He recognized the difference between a good nurse improvising under pressure and something else entirely. He watched the footage a 3rd time, and then he made the call. The man who arrived at Hargrove Medical Center at 8:47 a.m. was not wearing a hospital badge. He was mid-40s, with dark hair going silver at the temples, dressed in a jacket that was slightly too well made for the context, not expensive in a showy way, but in the functional way of someone who wore quality, because quality lasted and lasting mattered. He moved through the hospital's main lobby without hesitation, without the tentative look of a civilian in an unfamiliar institutional environment. He knew where the front desk was, where the elevators were, which direction would take him toward the administrative wing. He moved like someone who had read the building's layout before entering it. His name was Special Agent Desmond Kirby. He held credentials from a federal task force, operating under a designation that most people in law enforcement recognized by reputation rather than by operational detail. He had driven 4 hours through the pre-dawn dark to get to Caldwell, Ohio, because the footage the security supervisor had sent him at 6:30 a.m. was not the kind of thing you dealt with over the phone. He shook Dr. Fass's hand in the surgical suite waiting area at 8:53, showed him a court order that had been signed at 7:15, and said, "I need your complete trauma bay footage from last night's 11:50 arrival, and I need to speak with the nurse." Fass said, "I'd need to understand the basis for maintenance." "The court order covers it," Kirby said pleasantly. "I'll also need a private room." Nora was changing a wound dressing in room 208 when the charge nurse appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone delivering news they'd rather not deliver. "Dr. Fass wants you in the main conference room." Nora looked up from the dressing a post-surgical incision on a 70-year-old retired machinist named Mr. Hatfield, who had fallen asleep in his recliner, slipped off the arm of it and introduced 3 ribs to the corner of his coffee table. He was the kind of patient who apologized for the trouble his existence was causing, and who had brought the nursing staff a box of butterscotch candies on his second day, which had been universally appreciated. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Nora said. The charge nurse shifted uncomfortably. He said now, "Tell him 10 minutes. Nora returned to the dressing. Mr. Hatfield chuckled, then winced because chuckling hurt his ribs. "Go ahead, sweetheart. I'm not planning on going anywhere exciting." "We're almost done," Nora said, and kept working. She finished the dressing change, explained the appearance of the healing incision margin to Mr. Hatfield in terms that made him nod rather than worry, adjusted his pain medication timing on the chart, and spent 2 minutes making sure his call button was within reach before she washed her hands and walked to the conference room. Inside Foss, looking like a man who had not slept and was finding that condition disagreeable. And the man in the good jacket, seated at the head of the table, with a laptop open in front of him, and a stillness about him that was not relaxed. It was the stillness of someone maintaining patience as a professional discipline. Sarah sat in the chair nearest the door, not closest to either of them. Kirby introduced himself, name, agency designation. The words, federal investigation delivered, without particular inflection, like weather data. Then he turned the laptop around. On the screen, a frozen frame from the trauma bay footage. Clear, high resolution, overhead angle, Nora's hands in the wound. The catheter, the balloon inflation sequence. Every movement visible and unmistakable in its precision. She looked at it. Her expression did not change. "That's a resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion technique," Kirby said. "The specific variant you used, manual, tactile, without imaging guidance, was developed under a classified military trauma research program approximately 6 years ago. It exists in no civilian medical database and has never been published in any open-source literature. It was field-tested and operationalized exclusively by special operations, medical units deployed in high-casualty environments." He paused. "I'm going to ask you how a trauma nurse in Caldwell, Ohio, knows how to perform it. I'd like you to think carefully before you answer." Nora said nothing for a moment. "The patient was going to die," she said. "That's not what I asked. It's the part that mattered at the time." Kirby looked at her steadily. He wasn't unfriendly. He wasn't performing pressure. He was simply a man who had followed a thread to the end of it and was now sitting across from whatever the thread connected to. "We identified your John Doe," he said. "His name is Staff Sergeant Victor Malloy. Active duty, special operations. Traveling under a civilian alias, for reasons you don't currently need the details of. His unit medical file, which is classified, contains a notation from his unit surgeon. It says that if Malloy ever presents at a civilian facility with a high-velocity abdominal wound, the most likely site of catastrophic hemorrhage is the proximal left iliac, due to an incomplete repair he had 3 years ago following a classified incident overseas. He let that sit for a moment. You found that bleed without imaging, by touch, in under 90 seconds, in a chaotic trauma bay in the middle of the night." "I'm thorough," Nora said, "Miss Walsh." Kirby's voice was almost gentle. "I've spent 19 years in federal investigations. I've interviewed hundreds of people who were very good at their jobs. What I watched on that footage is not nursing skill, not even exceptional nursing skill. What I watched is special operations medical training applied under pressure, drawing on muscle memory that is only built through repetition in real combat conditions." He leaned forward slightly. "So I need you to tell me who you are, not the name on the badge. Who you actually are." The conference room was very quiet. Down the corridor, a cart rattled past. The intercom paged someone. The ordinary machinery of the hospital continued its ordinary work, indifferent to the conversation happening inside the room with the closed door. Nora looked at Foss, who was sitting very still, with the look of a man realizing, slowly and too late, That the woman he had ordered away from a bedside the previous night was operating in a register that had nothing to do with nursing. And then she looked back at Kirby. Before I answer anything, she said, I want to know who ran the flag. Kirby said nothing. Malloy came in as a John Doe, Nora continued. His alias held your own words. So whoever identified him through this hospital's intake and contacted you before dawn, they didn't ID him by name. They ID'd him by wound presentation and physiological profile, which means they had access to his classified medical record and they were running some kind of passive surveillance on regional trauma intake. Her voice was still level, still measured, but the precision of what she was saying had changed the temperature in the room. That's not a court order filed at 7 in the morning. That access was already in place. Before Malloy arrived, Kirby was quiet, which means someone knew he was in Caldwell, Nora said, and was waiting to see where he turned up. Fass looked between them with the specific expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting one conversation and found himself inside a completely different one. Kirby closed the laptop. Something in his posture had shifted not defensively, more like a recalibration. That's a very specific line of reasoning, he said. It's the obvious line of reasoning, Nora said. If you're thinking about how Malloy ended up in a trauma bay in the first place, and who benefits from knowing he survived. Kirby looked at her for a long moment. How many people are in this building right now that you brought with you? She asked. Enough, he said. Pull them in tighter, she said. Post-op recovery, surgical suite level 4, and the service entrance on the east side of the building. She said it the way someone recites a grocery list, practical, sequential, already done in her head. If the same people who flagged Malloy's arrival are monitoring for confirmation that he lived through the night, they already know is in recovery. They already know what I did to keep him there, and that changes what they do next and where they do it. The room went very still. Desmond Kirby studied her face for what felt like a long time. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and made a call that lasted 4 seconds. Two words, no preamble. Lock it down. Nora heard, from somewhere in the distant architecture of the building, the sound of doors closing, not slamming, just closing, the soft sequential finality of a building being secured one exit at a time. She sat with her hands folded on the table and waited. And Kirby looked at her with the expression of a man who had come to Caldwell, Ohio, expecting to find an anomaly, and was beginning to understand that what he had actually found was something considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous than an anomaly. All right, Miss Walsh, he said quietly. I think it's time you told me everything. All right, Miss Walsh, he said quietly. I think it's time you told me everything. Nora looked at him for a long moment, not the look of someone deciding whether to comply. The looks of someone deciding how much of the truth was currently safe to hand to a federal agent in a conference room that had not yet been swept for listening devices. Close the blinds, she said. Kirby didn't react visibly, but he nodded once at the door. The agent outside, the one Nora had clocked in the corridor, positioned at the 11 o'clock angle from the conference room entrance. Jacket slightly too heavy for August, stepped inside and pulled the cord on the interior blinds without a word. Foss cleared his throat. Should I stay? Nora said. Not rudely, like a decision had already been made about him. Foss stayed. Nora looked at the closed blinds for a moment, then at Kirby. She placed both hands flat on the table, and the gesture was oddly formal, not nervous, not deferential. Something closer to the way a person lays their cards face up when they've decided the hand is worth playing openly. My name is not Nora Walsh, she said. Kirby said nothing. He had known this, but knowing a thing and hearing it said aloud are different experiences, and he gave the moment the stillness it required. My name is Captain Adrian Voss, she said. Former rank, United States Army. Military Occupational Specialty 18D, Special Forces Medical Sergeant. I was attached to a Joint Special Operations Task Force under a classified deployment structure that I am not, even now, entirely free to name by its full designation. She paused. 3 years, 8 months ago, I was listed as killed in action, following an operation that went wrong in ways that were not accidental. The room was very quiet. Dr. Foss had stopped looking like a man who belonged in the conversation. He had the expression of someone who had accidentally walked through the wrong door and was now too far inside to pretend he hadn't. Kirby said, KIA listings under your name would be accessible through. The listing was processed under a compartmentalized channel, Nora Adrian said. It was not routed through standard casualty notification. It went through the same administrative structure that handled the operation itself, which means the people who processed my death record are the same people who had operational knowledge of what happened that night. She looked at him steadily, which is why I didn't surface through any official channel, because I didn't know how far the compromise went. Kirby leaned back in his chair by about half an inch. It was the most visible reaction she had gotten from him. Tell me about the operation. Adrian looked at the table for a moment. Not because she was emotional, because she was deciding the order of things. My unit's 6 operators, 2 intelligence liaisons. A signals technician was inserted into a location I'll describe as Eastern European Theater, targeting a procurement network that was moving restricted military hardware to non-state buyers, she said. We were 4 hours into the operation when we walked into a reception committee. Not a patrol that stumbled onto us, a prepared position. 12 to 15 hostiles with current intelligence on our entry route, our timeline, and our call signs. She said the last word with a flatness that contained a great deal. Someone gave them our operational file. How many did you lose? Everyone except me, she said. I survived because I went into a drainage channel when the shooting started and stayed underwater for approximately 4 minutes. I had a rebreather unit rated for 3. Her voice was entirely even. I surfaced 300 meters from the ambush site and walked out over the next 9 days using terrain navigation and whatever I could find. Foss made a very small sound. Neither of them looked at him. When I made contact with a support asset on day 9, Adrian continued, I was told the operation had been listed as a total loss. All personnel KIA. The asset strongly recommended I stay dead. She met Kirby's eyes. So I did. Kirby was quiet for a long moment. He was doing the kind of thinking that wasn't visible on the surface, running through implications, cross-referencing what she was saying against things he already knew, looking for the shape of a larger picture. The procurement network, he said. The one your unit was targeting. Do you have a name for it? Adrian's jaw tightened fractionally. The intelligence file we were working from identified the network's primary contractor as an entity called Harrow Group. Kirby's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. You recognize it, Adrian said. It wasn't a question. Keep going, he said. Harrow Group was listed as a private military contracting firm with legitimate Defense Department relationships, she said. Procurement consulting, logistics support, that kind of cover. What the file described was a secondary operation. Harrow was brokering the diversion of restricted military hardware weapon systems, encrypted communications equipment, medical technology with dual-use applications to buyers that the State Department would have considered highly problematic, was Kirby said. Past tense, Adrian agreed. Because 3 years ago, the people they sent after my unit apparently decided that the more permanent solution to the intelligence leak problem was eliminating the unit rather than the leak. She paused. But the diversion operation didn't stop. It evolved. And whatever Victor Malloy was doing in Caldwell, Ohio last night, whatever brought him here, and whatever put a bullet in him, I would be willing to bet a significant amount that Harrow Group is somewhere in the architecture of it. Kirby was quiet again, longer this time. Outside the conference room, the hospital continued its morning, the distant sound of a breakfast tray cart, an intercom announcement about a vehicle in the fire lane, the ordinary friction of an institution doing its work. All of it feeling from inside this room like sounds from another world. I need to make some calls, Kirby said. Before you do, Adrian said, I need you to understand something about what you're standing in. She leaned forward slightly. If Harrow has the capability to monitor regional trauma intake feeds and cross-reference classified medical files in real time, which the timeline of your drive here suggests they do, then they already know Malloy is alive. They already know he's at this hospital. And there is a category of decision that organizations like Harrow make about people who are alive in hospitals and who have information they'd prefer stay inaccessible. Kirby said, We have agents on the floor. You have agents in the corridors, she said. That's not the same thing. The service entrance on the east side feeds directly to the surgical recovery wing through a utility corridor that isn't on the public building map. I noticed it my first week here. She held his gaze. Malloy needs to be moved, not to another floor, out of this building. Kirby studied her for a moment. And you think Harrow has the reach to move on a federal protection detail? I think Harrow has the reach to know you're here, she said. That should answer your question. He made calls, 3 of them, rapid and quiet, stepping into the corner of the room, while Foss sat at the table with the expression of a man deeply reconsidering several life choices. Adrian sat still and waited. And while she waited, she was not idle. She was building a map in her head of everything she had said, cataloging what she had given away, what she had withheld, what she still needed. The 4th call Kirby made lasted longer. Something had changed in the way he was holding himself attention that hadn't been there before, or that had been there but was now visible. We have a problem, he said. Tell me. Malloy's post-op surgeon, Kirby said. The one who's been managing his care since the OR. His name is Dr. Ren Bouchard. He came on rotation here 8 weeks ago, transfer from a hospital in Pittsburgh. He looked at her directly. He doesn't exist in the Pittsburgh hospital's personnel system. The transfer documentation was filed through a third-party credentialing service. My team is running the service name right now, but he's already in the recovery wing, Adrian said. He was seen entering the wing 20 minutes ago. She was out of her chair before Kirby finished the sentence. Hey, he was up too, faster than she expected for a man his age, hand on her arm. You don't go in there alone. Then keep up, she said. She was already at the door. The Level 4 Surgical Recovery Wing had the particular atmosphere of a place designed to be calm, low lighting, reduced noise protocols, the deliberate muffling of everything that might spike a heart rate. It was not designed for what Adrian Walsh moved through it like. She wasn't running. Running attracted attention, triggered protocols, made people call security and ask questions. She walked fast and purposefully, which in a hospital was nearly invisible, because fast and purposeful was the resting state of clinical staff. Kirby was 2 steps behind her, and behind him one of his agents, a younger woman named Reyes, who had the good instinct to follow without demanding explanation. Malloy was in recovery room 412. Adrian knew this because she had checked the board at 4A. During her rounds, not because she'd known she would need it, but because she had been checking boards and noting details and building mental maps of environments for so long that it happened without decision. The door to 412 was closed. The recovery wing protocol was that doors stayed open unless a patient was being examined or a family member was present. There was no family here. There was no notation of an examination on the board outside. Adrian stopped outside the door. She didn't reach for the handle immediately. She stood slightly to the left of the frame, which put her out of the direct line of anything that might come from inside, and she listened. Mechanical sounds, the ventilator, the IV pump, the low rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. And beneath all of that, the specific quality of silence that a room has when there is a person in it who is trying very hard not to make sound. She looked at Kirby. He had read it too. His hand moved to his jacket. Adrian shook her head, once a single, small, precise movement. Her eyes went to the door handle, then to him, then to Reyes. She held up 2 fingers, pointed to either side of the door frame. Then she pushed the door open and walked in like she was there to check vitals. The man standing beside Victor Malloy's bed was wearing scrubs and a hospital ID badge and had a syringe in his right hand with the needle uncapped and positioned against the IV port of Malloy's central line. He was in his late 30s, unremarkably built, with the careful stillness of someone who had been in the room long enough to be comfortable and was now recalculating rapidly. He looked at Adrienne. She looked at the syringe. "Morning," she said. "You're not Dr. Bouchard." The man moved. He was fast, genuinely fast, with the specific speed of someone who had trained for this kind of encounter rather than hoping it wouldn't happen. He pulled the syringe back from the IV port and pivoted toward the door in a single continuous motion, and he would have been at the threshold in 2 strides, except that Adrienne was already moving on the second word of her sentence. She caught his right wrist with her left hand, turning his arm outward and down in a motion that was technically a compliance hold, but applied with a force that went past compliance into structural discouragement. The syringe hit the floor. The man tried to use his body weight to break the grip, and she went with it, rather than against it, using his momentum to redirect him sideways into the wall beside the door, with his arm behind his back, in a position that made any further movement a decision with serious orthopedic consequences. The entire sequence took approximately 3 seconds. Kirby came through the door with his weapon drawn and found a federal nurse in blue scrubs holding a man against the wall, with his arm twisted up behind his shoulder blade, and the man's face pressed sideways against the pale institutional paint, and a syringe on the floor, and Victor Malloy's cardiac monitor beeping steadily in the background, indifferent to the whole thing. "Don't move," Kirby said, which was somewhat redundant given the circumstances. Reyes was on the radio before Kirby finished the sentence. Adrienne held the position not with visible effort, just with the quiet, economical firmness of someone who knows exactly how much force the situation requires and has no interest in applying more or less. The man in the scrubs had gone still. His breathing was controlled, which told her something. Amateur panic when they're physically restrained. Trained people go still and start calculating. "What's in the syringe?" she said. He said nothing. "I'm going to find out either way," she said, without particular heat. "Telling me now just determines whether the next 20 minutes of your life are harder than they need to be." Silence. "The syringe," Kirby said from behind her to Reyes. Reyes had already bagged it without touching the needle. She was reading the label or the absence of one. "Unlabeled," Reyes said. "Clear fluid. Potassium," Adrienne said. "Not a guess." Read the size of the syringe, the volume, the positioning against the central line port where a bolus would hit the cardiac system before any other intervention was possible. Concentrated. "Cardiac arrest presentation, post-surgical patient, looks natural." She said it flatly. Standard approach. The man against the wall said nothing. But something in the set of his shoulders shifted fractionally, and Adrienne felt it through her hands. "He's not going to talk here," to Kirby. "To talk here," she said to Kirby. "Get him out of the building through a non-public exit and get someone to run the syringe contents in the next 30 minutes. I want to know the concentration." "I'm the federal agent," Kirby said, with a tone that was somewhere between professional and wry. "You're right," she said. "My apologies." She released the arm and stepped back. The man sagged slightly against the wall, not in relief, in the controlled way of someone managing pain. Reyes and Kirby had him in cuffs in the next 15 seconds. He didn't resist. He had gone to the place that trained people go when they've been caught, interior, contained, already somewhere else. Adrienne looked at Victor Malloy. He was unconscious, post-surgical sedation, and the monitors showed nothing alarming. The IV line was intact. The syringe had not been depressed. She checked the port anyway, methodically, and then checked the drip line and the bag and the connections. Everything clean. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down, which was an odd thing to do in a room that had just had an incident in it. But she sat down, and she looked at this man she had saved twice in 12 hours, once with her hands in a wound, and once by walking through a door, and she felt something that wasn't quite in anything she had a clean name for. Malloy was maybe 35. Big-framed, with the particular weathered quality that active-duty special operations personnel accumulate, not old, exactly, just marked by time spent in hard places. He had a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there for cosmetic reasons. He was breathing steadily. He was going to live. She wondered if he knew what he'd walked into. She wondered if whatever had put a bullet in him last night on Fennel Street was connected to the thing she'd spent 3.5 years waiting to understand. She suspected she already knew the answer. Kirby came back into the room 7 minutes later, alone. He looked at her sitting by the bed, and his expression was unreadable, which she was beginning to understand was his resting state. The scrubs and badge were fabricated, he said. Credentialing service that placed the false doctor. Bouchard traces back to a shell company. We're running the chain, but these things are layered. It's going to take time. How much time do we have? Adrian said. Kirby sat down in the other chair, the one on the far side of Malloy's bed, and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. It was the first genuinely human gesture she had seen from him, and it made him look his age in a way that nothing else had. My supervisor is being briefed now, he said. Once the full situation report lands on his desk, this escalates significantly. More resources, more personnel, more oversight. He paused. And more people who know you're alive. Adrian looked at Malloy. That's a problem. I know. If Harrow Group has the infiltration reach to plant someone in a hospital's medical staff with fabricated credentials, she said, then they have the reach to access whatever report your supervisor files. Which means the more official this gets, the more visible I become, and the more visible I become. The more they know they have a loose thread, Kirby said. Yeah, I've been thinking about that. The monitor beeped. The IV drip counted its steady rhythm. You said the procurement network evolved, Kirby said. After your operation. After they killed your team. What's it doing now? Adrian was quiet for a moment. She had been quiet about this for 3.5 years, quiet, in the practiced, habitual way of someone who has made silence into a survival mechanism, and opening it now felt like pulling a stitch that had held something closed for too long. Before I went dark, she said, the intelligence file on Harrow suggested they were transitioning. Moving away from hardware diversion weapons systems, equipment, and toward information. Classified operational data, deployment records, personnel files, signals intelligence. The kind of material that doesn't just arm buyers, it enables them to predict and counter future operations. She paused. Data doesn't have a serial number. You can't track it at a border. You can sell it to 3 different buyers, and it's still worth full price to each of them. Kirby said, stolen classified data. Stolen and brokered, she said. The hardware operation was the proof of concept. The data operation is the actual business. Kirby was very still. Malloy was special operations, Adrian said. He was in Caldwell, Ohio, under a civilian alias, which means he was traveling for reasons that weren't personal. He had a gunshot wound of a type and location consistent with a close-range engagement, not a random street crime. Whoever shot him knew where he'd be. She looked at Kirby. That's the same intelligence quality that put my team in an ambush 3 years ago. Someone gave Harrow his location. You're saying Harrow is still running the same playbook. I'm saying Harrow never stopped, she said. And if Malloy was running an operation against them, or adjacent to one, then whatever he was carrying physically in his memory is something they cannot afford to let him walk out of this hospital with. A long silence settled between them. Then Kirby said something that he said with the careful inflection of a man who had been thinking it since he walked into the conference room and was only now deciding to say it out loud. Captain Voss, he said. The rank felt strange. It had been a long time since anyone had used it. What you did in that trauma bay last night, and what you did in this room 20 minutes ago, those are not the actions of someone who has been out of the field for 3.5 years. Adrian looked at him. You've been staying current, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, carefully delivered. The medical skills, the tactical assessment. You didn't let those atrophy, which means you've been maintaining readiness for something. She was quiet. Have you been running something? He asked. On your own. The cardiac monitor beeped. Malloy's chest rose and fell. I've been watching, she said finally. Watching Harrow. Watching the data brokering operation. Watching who's buying. Watching the pattern of compromised operations, the ones that went wrong in ways that shouldn't have, that had the same signature as mine. The same quality of intelligence leak. She paused. 14 months in Caldwell, Ohio was not random. Agent Kirby. Harrow has a logistics node here. Has had one for at least 2 years. A distribution point for whatever they're moving through the region. Kirby's jaw tightened by a fraction. I was close to identifying the physical location, she said. Before last night made that timeline irrelevant. Why irrelevant? Because last night they tried to kill Malloy, she says, and this morning they sent someone to finish it. That means they're accelerating. Something is moving a deal, a transfer, a delivery window. They're cleaning up loose ends because they're close to a transaction and they can't afford any. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes. Which means whatever Malloy knows, or was carrying, or was trying to stop, it's about to happen. Not in weeks, in days. Kirby was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man who had walked into a hospital marching, expecting to find an anomalous nurse, and had instead found a 3-year-old intelligence operation sitting in the bones of a Rust Belt city, patient and quiet and waiting for exactly this kind of moment. I need everything you have, he said. Everything you've been watching. All of it. I know, she said. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs. She placed a small object on the surface of Malloy's bed rail, a standard-looking USB drive, matte black, the kind that could sit in a desk drawer and pass unremarked. She looked at it for a moment before she let go of it. 14 months, she said. Everything I've built. Every location, every contact name, every transaction I've been able to document. She looked up at Kirby. But before you take that, I need something from you. What? I need you to tell me, she said, whether the name Garrett Solon means anything to your task force. The change in Kirby's face was small, barely there. The kind of change that a person who had not spent years learning to read the difference between a genuine reaction and a managed one might have missed entirely. He said, "Where did you get that name?" And Adrian knew, from the specific way he said it, not the question, but the quality of the question, the fraction of a second it took him to choose the words that Garrett Solon was not a stranger to Desmond Kirby's task force, which meant the thread she had been following for 3.5 years, the one that started at the bottom of Tuzuma drainage channel in the dark, with 5 of her people dead above her. That thread had not gone cold. It had been running all this time, somewhere inside the federal structure that was now sitting 6 from her. And whoever Garrett Solon was, whatever he was to Kirby, whatever he was to Harrow Group, the answer to that question was about to change everything about the situation they were all standing inside. Adrian looked at Kirby and waited. Kirby didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. He picked up the USB drive from the bed rail and turned it between 2 fingers, not examining it, just giving his hands something to do while his mind worked through whatever calculation the name Garrett Solon had triggered. The cardiac monitor kept its steady count. Outside the room, the recovery wing maintained its enforced quiet, the particular institutional hush of a place designed to keep people from dying of overstimulation. Solons, Kirby said finally, is a person of interest in an ongoing federal investigation that I am not, at this moment, at liberty to detail. That's not an answer. It's the answer I can give you in this room, at this classification level, before my supervisor has been fully briefed on who you are and what you've just handed me. He looked at her directly. What I can tell you is that the name is not unknown to us, and the fact that it appears in your 14 months of independent surveillance is significant. How significant? Significantly significant, he said, which was not a satisfying answer, but had the quality of honesty about its own limitations. Solon has been a peripheral name in 3 separate federal investigations over the past 4 years. Each time, the evidence chain gets close enough to be interesting, and then experiences what my team has started calling administrative erosion documents that go missing, witnesses who recant digital records that develop inexplicable gaps. Someone inside is running interference, Adrian said. That has been the working hypothesis for approximately 18 months, Kirby said. We have not been able to identify who. Adrian looked at Malloy, at the steady rise and fall of his chest. Solon isn't peripheral, she said. He's the architecture. Everything I've watched Harrow Group do in this region, every logistics movement, every transaction I've been able to document it, traces back to decisions made by someone with federal-level access. Not just intelligence access, procurement access, contract authorization. The kind of position that can move money and materials and personnel without triggering standard overflags. She paused. Garrett Solon is a deputy director of acquisition and logistics at the Defense Intelligence Interface. Has been for 6 years. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the particular weight of a thing being confirmed that someone had suspected and hoped was wrong. If that's in your drive, Kirby said carefully, then what you've built is either the most important piece of evidence this investigation has produced, or it's a very sophisticated piece of disinformation, designed to redirect us toward a named target. He held her gaze. I'm not saying I think it's the latter. I'm saying that's the first thing my supervisor is going to say. I know, Adrian said, which is why the drive also contains the transaction records I've cross-referenced with Harrow's Caldwell Logistics node over the past 8 months. 14 documented instances of classified operational data appearing in Harrow's known communication channels within 72 hours of that data being generated inside DIA-adjacent systems. She let that land. Solon had authorization access to all 14 source datasets. Kirby turned the drive over in his fingers again. Once. We need to get out of this building, he said. Moving Malloy presented the kind of logistical problem that looked simple from outside and was genuinely complicated from the inside. He was 12 hours post-surgery on a repaired iliac artery, which meant his pressure was fragile. His fluid balance was being actively managed, and the risk of a secondary bleed from movement-induced stress was real enough that any reasonable trauma surgeon would have refused the transfer outright. Adrian explained this to Kirby in 45 seconds, including the specific hemodynamic parameters she needed maintained, the equipment that had to travel with the patient, and the maximum acceptable transport time. Kirby listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to appreciate about him. There's a federal medical 40 minutes from here, he said. What's the route? Interstate to the edge of the county, then back roads. Who knows that route right now besides you? A pause. My supervisor, the facility coordinator, and anyone who's been monitoring your communications since you arrived here this morning, she said. Another pause, longer. Back roads only, she said. No interstate. And I want the route decided in the next 10 minutes and not transmitted digitally written, on paper, handed to the driver in person. She looked at him. Does that sound excessive to you? 2 hours ago, it would have, he said. Right now, it sounds about right. The transfer took 41 minutes to coordinate. Adrian spent that time back at Malloy's bedside, monitoring his vitals manually, while the nursing staff, who had been told at Kirby's direction that this was a federal patient security situation, requiring temporary suspension of standard access protocols, maintained a confused, professionally compliant distance. Dr. Foss had been taken to a separate room by one of Kirby's agents and was, by all accounts, cooperating fully with the interview process in the way that people cooperate when they realize the alternative is considerably worse. At 10:23 a.m., they moved Malloy. Adrian rode in the transport vehicle, a nondescript van with medical equipment rather than a marked ambulance, because Kirby had understood without being told twice that a marked ambulance was a visible and trackable thing. She managed his vitals for the entire 40 minutes. His pressure held. The repaired iliac behaved itself. He came through the transfer with the resilience of a body that had been conditioned over years to absorb insult that would have incapacitated someone else. She watched him the whole way, and she thought about her team. About 5 people who had not had the particular luck of landing in a drainage channel at the right moment. The federal facility was a low building set back from a county road, surrounded by enough ordinary geography that you wouldn't look at it twice. Inside, it was functional and clean, and staffed by people who had federal clearances and did not ask unnecessary questions. They took Malloy into a monitored room, and 2 medical staff took over his care, and Adrian stepped back and let them, because the territorial instinct that had kept her close to him since last night was no longer operationally justified. Kirby met her in the corridor outside. "My supervisor is on his way," he said. "ETA 90 minutes. He's going to want to debrief you directly." "What's his name?" "Harlan Pruitt, Assistant Deputy Director, Joint Federal Task Force." Kirby paused. "He's thorough. He's going to push hard on the Solon angle, and he's going to push hard on why a KIA military officer has been running unsanctioned surveillance for over a year." "And what will you tell him?" "The truth," Kirby said. "That you saved a federal asset's life twice in 12 hours and handed us the most actionable intelligence lead this investigation has had in 4 years." He looked at her steadily. "What happens after that is above my authority level." Adrian nodded. She was already thinking ahead of the debrief, ahead of Pruitt, ahead of the next 90 minutes, running the operational timeline in her head, calculating windows and variables. "The Caldwell logistics node," she said. "Whatever Harrow is moving the data transfer I told you is imminent. If it happens before your team can action the intelligence on the drive, it's gone. Encrypted, distributed, sold. The evidence chain is the documentation of the transactions itself, and that only exists in a window before the exchange completes." "I understand that. Do you have a timeline on the window?" Kirby was quiet for a moment. "Based on signals intelligence, my team has been working separate from your drive. We've been looking at a 72-hour window that opened approximately 18 hours ago." "So 54 hours, Adrian said, roughly. "That's not enough time to get a full tactical action authorized through standard channels," she said. "Not with a target that has demonstrated federal-level interference capability. By the time the authorization chain clears, Solon or whoever is running his interference function will have flagged the operation, and the window will close." Kirby rubbed the back of his neck again, the same gesture as before his tell, for the moments when the situation was ahead of his available options. "I know," he said. "Then we have a problem that the debrief isn't going to solve," she said. She left that in the air and went to find coffee, because she had been awake for 27 hours, and she needed to think clearly for what was coming next. Pruitt arrived in 88 minutes, which told Adrian something about how seriously Kirby's report had been received. He was 60, compact, with close-cropped gray hair, and the quality of stillness that people who had spent decades in rooms where losing composure was a professional liability. He shook her hand without preamble, looked at her with the careful assessment of someone taking inventory, and said, "Let's sit down." They sat in a small room with a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked at a parking lot. Pruitt had a tablet and a legal pad and a pen that he used, which told Adrian He was the kind of person who didn't entirely trust digital capture for the things that mattered. He debriefed her for 2 hours. He was thorough, as Kirby had predicted. He circled back on details, cross-referenced timelines, pushed on inconsistencies with the precise persistence of someone who had done this many times, and understood that even people with excellent memories and genuine intentions carried distortions in their accounts that only became visible under systematic pressure. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was a professional doing a professional thing, and Adrian respected it even when it was uncomfortable. When they reached Garrett Solène, he went quiet for a moment in a specific way. "You understand," he said carefully, "that what you're alleging, if it's accurate, represents a penetration of federal infrastructure at a level that would constitute one of the most significant counterintelligence failures of the past decade." "I understand that," Adrian said. "And you also understand that an allegation of this magnitude, coming from an individual who has been operating unsanctioned under a false identity for 14 months after being listed as KIA, is going to face a significant credibility burden. I understand that too. So walk me through the transaction records again," Pruitt said. "The 14 instances, from the beginning. Every detail you have." She walked him through it. All of it, the methodical, unglamorous work of 14 months, watching patterns, cross-referencing data points, building a case from fragments that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. By the time she finished, Pruitt had filled 6 pages of his legal pad in a tight, economical handwriting. He looked at what he'd written for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "The Caldwell node," he said, "the physical location. You said you were close to identifying it before last night." "Close," she said, "not confirmed. I have 2 candidate locations based on logistics pattern analysis. A disused cold storage facility on the South Freight Corridor and a former light manufacturing building near the rail junction on Ellery Road." She paused. "The rail junction location is the stronger candidate. The freight corridor to that area connects to 3 different onward routes: road, rail, 2 regional airports within driving distance. It's the kind of node you'd choose if you needed flexibility." Pruitt wrote this down. "If I'm right about the timing window," Adrian said, "whatever Harrow is preparing to transfer will move through that node. The data physical media almost certainly, given that digital transmission at this classification level would be traceable, even with encryption, will be staged there before final handoff. And if we move on the location," Pruitt said, "we need to do it within the window. Before Solon's interference function can be activated. Yes." Pruitt set his pen down. "Precisely. Captain Voss, what I'm about to say is going to be slightly outside standard procedure, and I want you to hear it as the opening of a conversation rather than a decision. I'm listening. The tactical action required here, moving on a hardened logistics node run by a private military contractor with demonstrated infiltration capability within a compressed timeline, without triggering the federal communications channels that may be compromised, is not something that can be resourced through standard task force authorization in the time we have." He looked at her without apology. "It requires people who know the target, know the terrain, and can move without generating the kind of digital footprint that gets noticed." Adrian looked at him. "You've been watching this node for 8 months, he said. "You know the approach routes, the likely defensive posture, the operational patterns." He paused. "I can give you Kirby and a small team operating under a compartmentalized authorization. 4 people, maximum. Anything larger creates exactly the signature we can't afford. 4 people is very few for a hardened facility," she said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent light above them hummed with that particular low-frequency drone of institutional buildings everywhere. Through the window, the parking lot sat gray and ordinary in the afternoon light. She thought about 5 people who had gone into a position with current intelligence and walked into a prepared reception. She thought about the drainage channel, about 9 days walking out through terrain, that had not been designed for walking through. About 14 months of being unremarkable on purpose, of building something slow and careful from nothing, of waiting. When? She said. Tonight, Pruitt said, before the window closes further. Kirby gave her tactical gear that fit approximately correctly, which was better than she expected. The facility had a supply room with standard federal law enforcement equipment, and she went through it with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the difference between adequate preparation and inadequate preparation was not dramatic in advance and was catastrophic in outcome. She took a medical kit without being told to, because old habits were old habits, and because in her experience operations that didn't plan for casualties produced more of them. The team Pruitt assembled was small in the way small teams either are very effective or very dead, with limited middle ground. Kirby, she had already assessed experienced, reads situations quickly, doesn't panic, handles physical confrontation without overthinking it. Agent Reyes, whom she'd seen in the recovery wing, was young, but had the specific quality of self-containment that indicated genuine field training rather than classroom training. The fourth was a man named Duff, late 30s, former military by the way he wore the gear, quiet in the way people are quiet when they've learned that talking uses energy better spent elsewhere. They drove to the staging point in 2 vehicles. The night was overcast, the cloud cover pressing the city's light back down onto itself, which was operationally useful and weather nobody had arranged. Adrian rode with Kirby. She had a map in her head of the Ellery Road facility approach routes, a satellite image she had committed to memory 3 months ago, the delivery access pattern she'd observed, over 47 logged visits to positions within observation range. She had never been inside. She had the outside, the rhythm of it, the traffic pattern, the way lights appeared and disappeared at specific hours. Tell me what you know about their defensive posture, Kirby said. 4 to 6 personnel on site during active periods, she said. The pattern changes when something is moving increased perimeter activity. Vehicle rotation every 90 minutes rather than the standard 3-hour interval. The last 48 hours, based on my last observation run 2 days ago, suggested elevated activity. She paused, which is consistent with the transfer window. Armed? Without question. The personnel I've observed have the bearing and movement of trained contractors, not security guards. They're not decorative. Entry point? There's a loading bay on the north side that has a security gap between 11 and midnight shift transition. The overlap is imperfect. The main structure has 3 entry points I've identified. The loading bay is the least likely to have secondary coverage. She paused. But if they elevated their posture because the window is active, that gap may have been closed. So we may be going in blind on the entry. We're going in with my 8 months of baseline data against their current defensive state, she said, which is better than blind, but not as good as current surveillance. Kirby was quiet for a moment. What's your read on the media? Physical drives, you said. Harrow's pattern of operation has consistently avoided digital transmission for high-value material, she said. The hardware diversion operation used physical transport for the same reason. No signal means no intercept. The data brokering would follow the same logic. Physical drives, likely multiple copies as a transaction insurance measure, staged and ready for handoff. The buyer is on site for the exchange or a representative, someone who can authenticate the material and complete payment. She looked at the road ahead, which means there's a window where everything is in one place. Before the exchange completes, before the material distributes. That window is what we're trying to reach. The city found them as they drove south and east, the commercial density giving way to the industrial perimeter, the freight infrastructure of a mid-sized city, warehouses and rail yards, and the large footprint buildings that manufacturing left behind when it departed. The Ellery Road Rail Junction was this kind of geography, functional, unglamorous, the kind of area that people drove through rather than to. They pulled off Ellery Road onto a service track. 200 meters from the facility and killed the headlights. The second vehicle stopped 30 meters behind them. Adrian looked at the building through the windshield. Dark from the outside, which meant nothing. The windows on the structure she'd surveilled were covered. But there were vehicles in the parking area, 3, where the baseline pattern was 1. And the perimeter lighting was running on a rotation pattern she hadn't observed before, sweeping rather than static, designed to eliminate blind spots. "They've upgraded the posture," she said. "Does that change the approach?" She looked at the building for another 10 seconds, reading it. "Loading bay is out," she said. "The sweep pattern covers it now. But the rotation has a gap on the southeast corner. The sweep interval is longer there, probably because the terrain irregularity from the rail infrastructure creates a coverage assumption that isn't quite accurate." She could see at the physics of it, the geometry of a sweep pattern designed by someone who had looked at the layout on a map rather than from the ground. "If we move on the interval, we can reach the southeast wall without being in coverage long enough to trigger a response. From there, there's a secondary access point maintenance door that I've observed being used twice. It's the facility's service entry, probably alarmed but not monitored continuously, because the personnel I've seen use it did not wait for acknowledgement before proceeding." "Probably alarmed," Kirby said. "I work with the data I have," she said. Reyes's voice came through the earpiece. "Vehicle movement. East side. 1 car, slow, heading toward the main entrance." Adrian watched the headlights move through the gap in the facility's perimeter fence and stop near the main entrance. A figure got out, one person, alone, which was consistent with a buyer's representative rather than a primary buyer. Someone sent to authenticate before the principal committed. "The exchange hasn't happened yet," she said. "We're inside the window. How long do we have?" She watched the figure enter the building. "Calculated. Authentication takes time. Payment confirmation takes time. If they're moving physical media, they need to verify it's readable and complete before anything transfers." She looked at Kirby. "An hour, maybe less. Then we go now," Kirby said. She checked her kit. Medical bag. Sidearms she hadn't carried in 14 months, but whose weight felt immediately, uncomfortably familiar. Earpiece. She pulled the tactical vest on over the scrubs she was still wearing, which was absurd in a way that she noted and did not have time to address. They moved out in 2x2 formation, using the terrain break of a gravel berm that ran parallel to the southeast fence line. The cloud cover held. The sweep light moved in its imperfect rotation. Adrian counted the interval 11 seconds of exposure on the approach to the corner, which was 11 seconds more than she preferred. They hit the fence line. The secondary maintenance door was there, as she remembered it, set into the wall, with a keypad and a standard commercial alarm panel. She looked at the panel for a moment, then at the door frame, then at the conduit running along the exterior wall above it. "The alarm is wired to the same circuit as the perimeter lighting," she said quietly, "which they put on the rotations sweep tonight, which means they modified the circuit load." She crouched slightly and looked at the bottom of the conduit box. Modified circuit, modified ground pathway. Duff was already beside her, having arrived at the same conclusion from a different angle. He looked at her briefly, and she looked at him, and some professional recognition, and the wordless recognition passed between them, the wordless understanding of two people who had both learned certain things in certain contexts. 30 seconds, he said, not asking. 20 if you're fast, she said. He was fast. The door opened without alarm. Inside, the facility was larger than its exterior suggested warehouse space converted to operational use, with interior partitioning creating a front area, a middle storage zone, and a rear section that the layout logic of the building indicated was the primary operational space. The lighting was low and directional, and the sounds of the building were the sounds of an active site, ventilation, the low frequency of equipment running, and from the rear section, the unmistakable murmur of voices. Adrian moved forward in the dimness. reading the floor plan from the inside, adjusting her mental map with the real geometry of the space. Kirby was a step behind her. Reyes and Duff had taken the parallel aisle to the left, as arranged. She could hear the voices more clearly now. 2 people, maybe 3, in the rear section. The cadence of transaction, not conversation, but the specific rhythm of exchange, of verification, of terms being confirmed. She was 12 meters from the rear partition wall when the light changed. Not the overhead lights, the sweep light from outside had passed its gap. And now a shaft of it came through a gap in the covered windows on the east side, swept across the floor of the warehouse, and caught the side of her face for approximately 2 seconds before moving on. 2 seconds was enough. From the rear section, the voices stopped. And in the silence that followed, something that was not a footstep, but was very much like one moved in the darkness to her left, from an angle that suggested a position she had not accounted for, a static guard post, interior, not in any pattern she had observed from outside. Adrian went still. The darkness had a person in it, 5 meters to her left, and that person had seen something, and was now in the specific motionless state of someone deciding whether what they had seen was a threat. She did not breathe. The guard's radio crackled, a single static burst, the kind of automated check-in signal that told a central monitor guard was alive and in position. The guard's hand moved to the radio, reaching to respond. And in that half second of divided attention, Adrian moved. What followed was not clean. It never was, regardless of what the training scenarios implied. The guard was larger than her and had the reaction time of someone who had been professionally paranoid for years, and the engagement in the dark, in close quarters, among shelving units and equipment she couldn't fully see, lasted long enough that it was measured in breaths rather than seconds. Something connected with her left shoulder hard, and she filed the pain away for later in the specific mental compartment that field medicine had taught her existed for that purpose. She got to the position she needed to get to, and the guard went down and stayed down, and she crouched in the dark, breathing carefully and listening. From the rear section, a voice, Petrov. Check in. Silence, Petrov. And then, from somewhere she hadn't tracked, a second guard's footstep moving fast, toward the commotion, toward her position, not cautiously, but with the committed speed of someone responding to a threat alert rather than investigating an anomaly. And simultaneously, from the rear section, the sound of something being moved quickly, with urgency, the specific sound of people deciding that whatever was happening in their facilities was the signal to stop waiting. The exchange was accelerating. Kirby's voice came through the earpiece, barely a breath. We have contact in the front. 2, armed, were pinned at the east aisle. Adrian looked at the rear partition wall, 12 meters away, with one fast guard between her and it and the sound of a transaction being completed on the other side. She looked at her medical bag. She looked at the geometry of the space. And she understood with the specific cold clarity of someone who has done this calculation before under worse conditions, that the next 30 seconds would determine whether everything she had built over 14 months, every patient hour of watching and documenting and waiting, walked out of this building or disappeared into it. She moved. The guard came around the corner of the shelving unit at a run, weapon raised, and found the aisle empty. Because Adrian had gone over the shelving unit rather than around it, an 8-foot climb, executed in the dark by feel alone, driven by a shoulder that was screaming information she was not currently accepting, and was now on top of the unit, moving parallel to the aisle toward the rear partition, and she dropped off the far end of it onto the floor of the rear section just as the partition door opened from the inside. The room she landed in had 3 people in it. 2 of them she didn't know. The third was standing at a table with a hard case in front of him, in the act of closing the case's latches, with the particular unhurried precision of a man who had done this many times, and he looked up when she landed, and across the distance of the room their eyes met, and she saw recognition cross his face before she had any reason for recognition to be there. Because he knew her, and she did not know him. But she knew his name. She knew it because it was in her drive. It was in 14 months of cross-reference transaction data and logistics patterns and authorization records. It was the name she had said in the conference room to Desmond Kirby, "Catch me," and watched Kirby's face change. Garrett Solon looked at Adrian Voss, at a woman who had been dead for 3.5 years, and for the first time in what she suspected was a very long time, his face showed something unplanned. He said, very quietly, "You're not possible. Close the case," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "Step away from the table. And keep your hands exactly where I can see them." He looked at her for one more second. Then he looked at the two men in the room with him, men who were armed and who were now also looking at her, and something passed between the three of them that was not a word but was very much a decision. And Solon's hand moved not toward her, but toward the case, toward the latch he had just closed. And Adrian understood in the fraction of a second, before it happened, that he was not reaching for the case. He was reaching for what was under it. She was already moving before his hand completed the arc. The table between them was standard industrial steel frame, composite surface, roughly the dimensions of something designed to hold significant weight. Adrian went left and low, dropping her shoulder and using the shelf unit behind her as a brace point, because going right would have put her in the direct line of the second man, who had already registered the situation and was rotating to bring his weapon around. She heard the hard case hit the floor. Solon had swept it off the table with the same motion, either deliberately or as a consequence of grabbing what was underneath, and the sound of it was the sound of something significant landing badly. And she filed that in the part of her mind tracking the case's location, while the rest of her managed the immediate geometry. The weapon Solon had under the case was a compact sidearm, and he was not slow with it. He had the practice speed of someone who had spent enough time in proximity to field operations to understand that hesitation in this specific moment was that got you killed rather than the thing that saved you. He came up with the weapon fast. Adrian was faster, and she was lower, and she closed the distance before he had a firing angle that wouldn't also risk the man behind her. She caught his weapon hand at the wrist with both of hers, drove it up and sideways, and the gun discharged into the ceiling, a single sharp sound in the enclosed space that was immediately the loudest thing that had happened tonight, and would bring every armed person in the facility to this room inside of 30 seconds. Plaster dust came down in a brief white shower. Solon was stronger than he looked. He had the core strength of someone who had maintained physical conditioning, long past the age when most desk-level officials stopped bothering, and he used it pivoting into her grip, trying to use body mass to break the wrist control. She held the arm, but the pivot brought his elbow across, and it caught her on the already damaged left shoulder, and the pain was immediate and specific, and she made a sound she hadn't intended. She did not let go. The second man in the room came around the table, and she had perhaps 2 seconds before his angle was clean. She used those 2 seconds to drive Solon backward into the partition wall. His shoulder blade and the back of his skull hit the manufactured panel hard enough that the entire wall section shook, and his grip on the weapon loosened by 1 critical degree, and she stripped it from his hand and put 3 feet of distance between them in a single backward step. 2 weapons now, his and hers. The second man stopped moving. The third man in the room, the one she had classed as a buyer's representative, was pressed against the far wall with his hands up at shoulder height, which was either genuine fear or a very good simulation of it, and either way, it was the correct choice. "Don't," Adrian said to the second man. Quiet, specific, the single syllable of someone who means it with no additional decoration. He assessed her for approximately 2 seconds, the weapon, the stance, the specific quality of her stillness, and made the calculation. His weapon went to the floor. Hands came up. Solon was against the wall, one hand pressed to the back of his head, blood at his hairline from where the panel had caught him. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, because she had only ever seen him as a name in a data set, as a pattern in a logistics record, as the shape of a person assembled from evidence rather than presence. In person, he was older than his file photos' late 50s, with the particular weathering of a man who had been managing a significant secret for a long time, and who was now looking at the specific consequence of that secret standing in front of him with his own gun. He said, with a composure that was either genuine or the last functional performance of a man running entirely on trained reflex. "You have no legal authority here." "I have both your guns," she said. "We can work out the legal philosophy in a minute." She looked at the hard case on the floor. It had landed on its side, latches intact. She looked at it for exactly long enough to confirm. It hadn't opened, then looked back up. Kirby's voice in her ear. "We're clear on the east aisle. 2 in custody. What's your status?" "Rear section secure," she said. 3 persons detained. Solon is here." She paused one deliberate beat, because she knew what that information was going to do to the tone of Kirby's response. The silence in the earpiece lasted about a second longer than usual. "Say that again." "Garrett Solon," she said, "in person." "Rear section?" Another beat. "Then on my way." She kept her eyes on Solon and the second man. Her shoulder was communicating at high volume, and she was managing that communication with the practiced dissociation of someone who knew the difference between pain that was information and pain that was noise. This was mostly noise. The shoulder was functional. She would deal with the structural question later. The buyer's representative, still against the wall, still with his hands up, said in accented English, "I am a private citizen. I have done nothing illegal. Being in this room at this time of night with these people," Adrian said, "is going to require some explanation. But that's not a conversation we're having right now." Kirby came through the partition door with Reyes a half step behind him, Duff covering the entry. He took in the room in a single sweep the two men standing, Solon against the wall, the case on the floor, Adrian with 2 weapons, and a shoulder she was visibly not discussing. He looked at Solon for a long moment. Solon looked back at him with the expression of a man who was reclassifying a situation in real time, who had walked into this facility tonight expecting a completed transaction and a clean exit, and was now performing the internal revision that the reality in front of him required. "Deputy Director," Kirby said. He said it without inflection. Just the title, sitting in the air of the room. "Agent Kirby." Solon's voice was level. "You understand that whatever you think you have here." "We'll do this properly," Kirby said. "Reyes." Reyes had the cuffs. Solon did not resist. He was too intelligent to resist, which made it worse in a way that Adrian noted without satisfaction. The buyer's representative got the same treatment, minus the composure. The second armed man was secured by Duff. Adrian set both weapons on the table, cleared them with practiced efficiency, and then crouched beside the hard case. She looked at the latches. Looked at Kirby. "You should open this," she said. "Chain of custody needs to be yours." Kirby crouched beside her. He opened the latches and lifted the lid. Inside were 4 drives. Military-grade encrypted storage, each one tagged with a classification marking that Adrian recognized from her operational background, the specific designation used for compartmentalized signals intelligence packages. The kind of data that described not just what field units had done, but what they were currently doing, where they were, under what cover. Active deployment data. If this had transferred tonight, the exposure wouldn't be historical. It would be immediate. Ongoing operations, personnel currently in the field, cover identities currently in use. The damage would not be measured in what had already happened. It would be measured in what would happen next. Kirby looked at the drives for a moment, then at Adrian. "You built this," he said, not in wonder exactly, in the tone of someone fully revising their assessment of a situation. "I watched it," she said. "There's a difference." She stood up, and the shoulder objected to the movement with a pointed specificity that she accepted without audible acknowledgement. Reyes caught the way she moved and looked at her with professional attention. "You're hurt," Reyes said. "I'm functional," Adrian said. "Those are not the same." "I know," Adrian said. After. They secured the facility systematically over the next 40 minutes. 2 additional Harrow personnel were found in the front section, the guards who had engaged Kirby and Reyes on the east aisle, and a 5th in a monitoring room adjacent to the main entrance who had apparently made the decision to take no action. When the situation inside escalated, which was either cowardice or a private recalculation, about which side of this outcome he preferred to be associated with. Adrian moved through the facility while Reyes and Duff managed the detainees, cataloging what she could see: the equipment, the documentation, the physical evidence of a logistics operation that had been running in this space for a very long time. There were records here, physical records, which told her something about Harrow's operational security philosophy. They didn't trust digital storage any more than they trusted digital transmission. Paper and physical media in a disused building in a Rust Belt city, hidden in the unglamorous infrastructure of a place that nobody with resources would think to look. She found something else in the rear section's secondary storage area. Filing boxes, 8 of them, stacked against the back wall behind a shelving unit that had been positioned to obscure them. She pulled the shelving unit out one-handed, the left arm not participating, and opened the nearest box. Personnel files. Military. Classified. She went through 3 before she understood what she was looking at. These were not files for personnel whose data was being sold. These were files on personnel who had been targeted operational dossiers built on specific military and intelligence individuals who, for reasons that the files made clear without stating directly, had gotten close enough to Harrow's operation to represent a threat. Dossiers with movement logs, with communication intercepts, with notes about vulnerabilities and contact points, and what kind of pressure worked on which kind of person. And in the 7th box, in a manila folder, with a case reference number she did not recognize, she found a file with her name on it. Not Nora Walsh, Adrian Voss. Her real name on a file that had been compiled by people who had known she was alive for considerably longer than tonight. She stood very still in the storage room for a moment. The file was thick photographs, surveillance notes, a timeline of her movements in Caldwell that went back 11 months. They had found her, or found evidence of her, nearly a year ago, and they had not moved on her. They had watched her and documented her, and made a calculation that the cost-benefit of eliminating a KIA military officer operating under a false identity was outweighed by something, by what she represented as a surveillance risk, perhaps, or by what moving on her would signal about Harrow's own intelligence capabilities. They had been watching her watch them. And someone had decided that, as long as she stayed contained, as long as she watched without acting, without surfacing, without making contact with federal agencies, a manageable variable rather than an existential one. Victor Malloy's arrival had changed that calculation. She understood now why the assassination attempt at the hospital had been so fast. It wasn't just about Malloy. It was about the fact that Malloy's arrival and her intervention had, in Harrow's assessment, connected 2 threads that had been safely separate: the threat of a surviving KIA medic with operational knowledge, and the threat of an active special operations asset investigating Harrow's current activities. Separately, manageable. Together, not. She took the file. She took the dossiers on the other targeted personnel. She carried all of it out to the main section and set it on the table where Kirby was working through the case documentations with Reyes. He looked at the stack of files and then at her face, and whatever he saw in her face told him something before she spoke. "They knew I was alive," she said, "for 11 months. He looked at the top file, at her name. "They watched me and decided I was manageable, as long as I stayed passive," she said. The decision to move on me last night wasn't a panic response to Malloy's arrival. It was a pre-planned contingency that they activated when the two threats converged. Kirby was quiet for a moment. That means Solon knew. Solon authorized the watch on me, she said. It's in the documentation methodology. The authorization codes on the surveillance logs match the format of his authorization signature in the other transaction records. She looked at the file in his hands. He's known for 11 months that there was a surviving witness to the original ambush, and he chose containment over elimination because elimination carried operational risk. Until it didn't, Kirby said. Until it didn't, she agreed. She sat down because the shoulder was now having a conversation she could no longer defer, and because she had been awake for over 30 hours, and the adrenaline that had been doing the structural support work of the past several hours was beginning its withdrawal. Kirby looked at her with an expression that was not quite concern but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who had been in the field long enough to recognize what a person looked like when they were holding themselves together through will rather than resources. We need to get your shoulder looked at, he said. I know. Before we get back to the facility. I know, she said again. There's a first aid kit in my bag. Reyes can manage it if she has 10 minutes. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant, Adrian said. The shoulder can wait 20 minutes. Solon can't. She looked across the room at him, at Garrett Solon, seated against the wall with his wrists cuffed and his composure in the process of a slow, visible erosion. I want to hear him talk. Solon did not talk immediately. That was expected. He was too experienced to talk immediately, too aware of what talking cost, before he knew the full dimensions of what was in the room with him. He sat against a Sadatsi, Tumsusuli. He sat against the wall with the specific quality of someone running calculations, and Adrian let him run them because she knew something he did not yet know. She sat on a crate 10 feet from him, in the unhurried posture of someone who had nowhere else to be, and no deadline as she was working against, and she looked at him with the steady gray eyes that gave nothing away, and she waited. It was Duff who set the stack of files from the storage room on the floor in front of Solon. Not with theater, just set them down and stepped back. Factual. Solon looked at the stack. He looked at the dossiers, the surveillance logs, the authorization codes with his signature format on them. He said nothing. The drives in the case, Adrian said. The surveillance records. Your authorization logs cross-referenced with 14 documented instances of classified data appearing in Harrow's communication channels. She did not move, did not lean forward, did not perform any of the pressure behaviors she had watched federal interrogators use over the years. Just spoke evenly, like someone reading a grocery list. The physical records from that storage room, including the personnel dossiers on 17 military and intelligence individuals who were surveilled and assessed as elimination candidates. She paused. And a file with my name on it, documenting 11 months of sanctioned surveillance of a person your organization's own records show you knew, was a surviving witness to a military ambush that your authorization codes connect you to. Solon looked at the floor for a moment. You're going to want a lawyer, she said. That's the right call, and I'm not telling you not to make it. What I'm telling you is that by the time a lawyer arrives, this building will have been processed by a federal evidence team, and everything I've just described will be in a secure chain of custody, and the window for the kind of cooperation that meaningfully changes a sentencing outcome will be considerably narrower. She let that sit. The ambush, 3 years and 8 months ago. The unit that was sold. I want the name of the person inside the intelligence chain who gave Harrow our operational file. Solon looked up at her. She looked back at him. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, because she suspected Solon had long since worked through the architecture that guilt required and had come out the other side into the cold, functional space where decisions like his were managed as professional risk rather than moral weight. What moved across his face was something more like the specific recognition of a person who has been outmaneuvered and is now assessing what, if anything, remains to be salvaged. The authorization came from above my level, he says. He said it with the careful precision of someone giving up one thing to protect another. The ambush. The decision to sell the operational file. That was not a decision I made. But you knew, Adrian said. A pause. Yes. And you ran interference when federal investigations got close. The pause was longer this time. I managed the exposure risk. That's different. It isn't, she said. But we can argue taxonomy later. The name. Solon looked at the floor. He was running his calculation, and she could see it running the mental arithmetic of a man who had spent 30 years in positions of institutional power and who understood, perhaps for the first time with genuine clarity, that the institutional power was no longer available as a resource. Connolly, he said. Warren Connolly, DI Senior Director, Near East and Special Operations Liaison. He initiated the contact with Harrow Group 12 years ago. He looked up and there was something in his face now that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it, the specific lightness of a person putting down a weight they have carried too long, even if the circumstances of putting it down were entirely unwelcome. The original operation was his concept. The data brokering, the hardware diversion, all of it. I came in 6 years ago when Connolly needed someone to manage the federal exposure risk. Kirby was recording. Reyes was recording. Duff was standing at the door with the expression of someone who had heard a lot of things over the years and was adding this to the list. Adrian looked at Solon for a moment longer. The 5 people who died in that ambush, she said. Their names were Sergeant First Class Dana Pruitt, Staff Sergeant Marco Llewellyn, Sergeant Tobias Ragg, Chief Warrant Officer Felicia Barron, and Corporal James Holt. She said each name with the flat, careful articulation of someone who has said them many times in private. They had families. They were buried as casualties of an operation that the official record described as a non-hostile incident. She paused. Connolly authorized the sale of the operational file that put them in that ambush. Solon said nothing. Is that correct? She said. It was not a question in the ordinary sense. He looked at the floor. Yes. The room was very quiet. Kirby looked at Adrian. She looked at the floor for a moment, at the middle distance of a warehouse floor in a disused building in Caldwell, Ohio, and in the silence she did something she had not done. In 3.5 years she let the names sit in the air, and she did not immediately push them back into the functional compartment. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then she stood up and picked up her medical bag and looked at Reyes. I'll take that 10 minutes now, she said. Reyes was competent and quick, which Adrian had expected. The shoulder was not dislocated as a significant relief, because a dislocation would have been a conversation, but the acromioclavicular joint had taken a substantial hit sent, and the surrounding musculature was in open revolt. Reyes strapped it with the materials in the kit, and Adrian rotated the arm through its available range and accepted the result as workable. You need imaging, Reyes said. I need a lot of things, Adrian said. Imaging is in the top 5. Reyes almost smiled. You're going to be impossible to treat, aren't you? Probably, Adrian said. Outside the storage room where Reyes had worked, she could hear Kirby on the phone calling in the full federal response now, the evidence teams and the additional agents, and the chain of custody apparatus that would descend on this building and process it with the grinding thoroughness of federal procedure. It would take hours, days, for the full analysis. Warren Connolly's name was already in the system, delivered to Pruitt by Kirby while Adrian was getting her shoulder strapped. And the call Kirby had made immediately after was to an arrest coordination unit, whose job was now to locate and detain a DIA senior director before the news of what had happened in Caldwell tonight reached anyone with the capacity to provide warning. The window for that was measured in hours, and they all knew it. She came back into the main section and looked at the room at the evidence, the detainees, the case with the 4 drives sitting open on the table, with Kirby's documentation tags on each one. She looked at the stack of personnel dossiers that would, in the coming days, result in 17 military and intelligence individuals being told that they had been surveilled and assessed as threats by a domestic criminal network operating at the highest levels of institutional access. She looked at the file with her name on it. She picked it up and stood with it for a moment. It was thick in her hands, 11 months of her life, documented by people who had known she was alive and had made the calculation that she wasn't worth the operational cost of eliminating. She set it back down on the table. She didn't need it. Everything it contained, she had lived. Kirby came to stand beside her, looking at the table. Pruitt wants you back at the facility for a full debrief as soon as the scene is secure, he said. Couple of hours, maybe 3. I know. He's also talking about the question of your status, Kirby said. The KIA listing, the unsanctioned operation, the false identity. There's going to be a process. I know that too. It won't be clean, he said. These things never are. There'll be people in the chain who are uncomfortable with how this went, who will push back on the methods. Meinitz? Kirby, she said. He stopped. I've been in a drainage channel underwater for 4 minutes, she said. I've walked 9 days through hostile terrain with a rebreather malfunction and no resupply. I've spent 14 months being invisible on purpose in a Rust Belt city, watching a criminal network operate in my backyard and building a case from nothing. She looked at him. I am not worried about uncomfortable people in a chain. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of someone settling an assessment they had been forming since early that morning. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. From across the room, one of the Harapro personnel in custody said something to the agent, holding him a protest, a demand, the beginning of the argument his lawyer would later formalize. The agent responded with the patient, immovable quiet of someone who had heard the argument before and found it unpersuasive. Adrian looked at Solon. He was looking at the floor. The composure was entirely gone now, not dramatically, not in any cinematic way, just gradually dissolved over the past hour by the weight of what was in this room with him. The evidence and the names and the specific presence of the woman he had authorized surveillance on for 11 months and who was now standing in the facility where he had expected to complete a transaction worth more money than most countries spent on infrastructure in a year. He looked up and found her looking at him, and he held it for approximately 3 seconds before he looked away. Adrian picked up her medical bag and walked to the door. She stopped just outside it, in the gap between the facility's interior light and the dark of the Ohio night, and she took a breath of outside air cold and carrying the particular iron smell of the rail infrastructure nearby, not clean exactly, but real in a way that institutional air never was. She could hear distant and rhythmic the sound of a freight train moving through the junction, the heavy mechanical heartbeat of an industrial city doing its indifferent work. She stood there for a moment. Inside, one of Kirby's agents was going through the filing boxes from storage with the methodical patience of a person who understood that everything in those boxes was a thread, and that threads led somewhere, and somewhere of enough threads was a structure that had existed long enough to believe it was permanent. Structures that believed they were permanent were, in Adrian's experience, always wrong. She was about to go back inside when Kirby appeared behind her. He had his phone in his hand, and his expression had shifted in the specific way. That expressions shifted, information arrived that reorganized the situation. Conley, he said. She turned. The arrest unit made contact 40 minutes ago, Kirby said. He paused in a way that told her the pause was not good news. His residential address was empty. Personal vehicle is at his home. No passport activity in the past 72 hours. Another pause. But his secondary vehicle, a vehicle registered to a private company, 2 steps removed from him in the ownership chain, pinged a traffic camera in the Caldwell metro area at 11:47 tonight. Adrian went still. He's here, she said. Was here. Kirby said. The camera is on Route 9, Southeast Corridor. That's 3 miles from this facility, she said, and 9 miles from Hargrove Medical Center, Kirby said. She was already moving back inside because the arithmetic was not complicated. Connolly had not run when the situation in the facility went wrong. He had moved toward the remaining loose end. The one that was currently sedated and post-surgical in a federal medical facility that Connolly, with his access and his 12 years of operational experience, absolutely had the capability to locate. Victor Malloy was alive, and the man who had authorized the sale of 5 people's lives was 9 miles away, and he knew it. She was through the door before Kirby finished the sentence. The arithmetic was simple, and the arithmetic was terrible. Connolly had been in the area before the facility operation went wrong, which meant he had come to Caldwell tonight for reasons that went beyond observing the transaction. He had come because the transaction was the cover, the clean exit point. Data transferred, payment received, and then the remaining threads get cut. Malloy was a thread. Adrian, who he believed was contained and manageable, had just become a much larger thread the moment his surveillance network registered what happened in that building tonight. She ran the logistics as she moved. The federal medical facility was 40 minutes from here under normal driving. Under urgent driving, 30. Connolly had a 9-mile head start from the traffic camera ping, which was already 40 minutes old, which meant he was either already there or within minutes of arriving. Call the facility, she said to Kirby, who was already on the phone. Not through the standard task force channel direct line, the number Pruitt used once we transferred Malloy. Tell them lockdown, no access. Nobody enters Malloy's wing who isn't already badged and physically known to the on-site staff. Kirby relayed it. She heard the call connect, heard him deliver the message, heard the 4-second pause on the other end that indicated someone on the receiving end recalibrating fast. They're locking down, Kirby said. How many agents on site? 2. Pruitt left 2 when we came here. 2 was a number that worked against a standard threat. Against Warren Connolly, a man who had run covert operations for 12 years, who had the access codes and the contacts and the specific institutional knowledge of federal facility security protocols. 2 was a number that required supplementing immediately. Reyes stays here, Adrian said. You, me, and Duff. You have 1 working arm, Kirby said. I have 1 arm I'm being conservative with, she said. That's different. He didn't argue, which she was beginning to understand was one of his better qualities. They were in the vehicle in 4 minutes. Duff drove, because Duff drove the way people drove when they had done vehicle operations in context considerably more demanding than a county road in Ohio at 2 in the morning, fast without being reckless. Reading the road ahead and making decisions early rather than late. Adrian sat in the back with her medical bag on the seat beside her and her phone in her hand, and she pulled up the mental map of the federal facility, the layout she had observed when they arrived, the entry points, the parking configuration, the approach angles. The facility has 2 vehicle entrances, she said. The main approach and a service road on the south side. Connolly won't use the main approach, too visible, too easily locked. The service road feeds to the utility entrance, which in a building like that is going to have either a keypad or a proximity reader. He'd need the code or a card, Kirby said. He has 12 years of federal facility access, she said. He knows how these systems work, and he knows the people who administer them. The question isn't whether he can get in. The question is how long it takes him. We're 22 minutes out, Duff said. She did the math on that and did not like the result. Her phone showed a text from Kirby's direct line to the facility. The on-site agents had been reached and had confirmed the wing lockdown. Malloy's room was secured. Staff movement was restricted. That bought time. How much time was the variable she couldn't calculate from 22 minutes away? She looked at the dark road ahead, and she thought about the 5 names she had said in the warehouse to set. Dana Pruitt, Marco Llewellyn, Tobias Ragg, Felicia Barron, James Holt. She had said those names in front of Garrett Solon and watched his face, and what she had seen there was not remorse. She had expected no remorse from a man like Solon, but something smaller and uglier. The specific discomfort of a person confronted with the human weight of a decision they had classified long ago as a professional necessity. Connolly would be worse. Connolly had made the original decision. She thought about what it meant that he was here, that he had driven to Caldwell tonight, not fled, had moved toward the problem rather than away from it. That was not the behavior of a man who was losing his composure. That was the behavior of a man who had been managing situations like this for a very long time and who, right up until the moment the evidence proved otherwise, that he could manage this one too. The facility appeared in the headlights at 19 minutes, the low building set back from the county road, lit at its perimeter, looking quiet from the outside in the way that locked-up down buildings look quiet from the outside while being considerably less quiet inside. There was a vehicle on the service road, dark, late model, parked at an angle that suggested a rapid stop rather than an intentional parking choice. Adrian said, "That's him." Duff had already adjusted course. They came in on the main approach rather than the service road because the service road was now a scene rather than an access point, and Adrian was out of the vehicle while it was still decelerating, moving toward the building's main entrance with the specific urgency of someone who had done the math on the time elapsed since that vehicle stopped. The main entrance agents knew they were coming. Kirby had called ahead in the last mile. The door opened before she reached it. Inside, the two on-site agents, both standing, both alert, neither of them with the look of men who had encountered a problem yet. That was good. That meant Connolly was still outside, or still in the utility section, still working the entry problem. "Service entrance?" she said. Alarmed when he tried it, the nearer agent said, "We got the alert 4 minutes ago. Haven't had visual on him since." 4 minutes. A man who understood federal facility layouts had 4 minutes to find an alternative. "Building schematic," she said. "Do you have it?" He pulled it up on a tablet. She had it for 6 seconds, the specific kind of looking that converted a two-dimensional diagram into a three-dimensional map, absorbing the relationships between spaces, the utility corridors, the HVAC access, the connections between the publicly mapped area and the sections that building schematics always underrepresented, because buildings were never entirely what their drawings said they were. "HVAC service corridor," she said, pointing. "It connects the utility section to the internal maintenance spine. The maintenance spine runs parallel to the recovery wing on this side." She looked up. "He doesn't need to be in the wing. He needs to be adjacent to it, with access to the internal infrastructure." Kirby looked at the schematic. "Malloy's room has an HVAC duct intake on the east wall," the second agent said. He had caught up faster than she expected. She was already moving. The maintenance spine was exactly what building maintenance spines always were: functional, unglamorous, with the specific smell of mechanical systems doing their work in the dark. Pipes, conduit, the low industrial hum of climate control infrastructure. Low light, the kind provided for maintenance access rather than human comfort. She moved through it with the lights from Kirby's phone casting forward shadows, and she was aware of her shoulder with every step, but managing it, the way she had managed things in drainage channels and across 9 days of hostile terrain, by acknowledging the constraint and building around it rather than pretending it wasn't there. She heard him before she saw him, not footsteps. Breathing, the controlled, deliberate breathing of someone who was managing their own physical state, who had been doing something strenuous and was now holding still, switching still. From the direction of the duct access panel, that, on the schematic, corresponded to the section of wall adjacent to the recovery wing. She stopped. Kirby was 4 steps behind her. She held up a fist stop, and he stopped. She listened. The breathing was 3 meters ahead, around the curve of the corridor where the maintenance spine bent to follow the building's exterior wall. She could hear, beneath the breathing, the sound of metal a panel being worked with the careful patience of someone who understood that noise was the enemy. She thought about what she was walking toward. Warren Connolly was 61 years old and had run covert operations for 12 years and had made the decision that killed 5 people. And he was around that corner in the dark with, in all likelihood, a weapon and the specific dangerous Watts quality of a person who had nothing left to protect except themselves. She had one fully functional arm. She had a sidearm. She had the building schematic in her head and the sound of his breathing and the knowledge, which was not nothing, of exactly who this man was and how he thought. She moved around the corner. Connolly was crouched at the access panel, a small tool in her hand and a flashlight tucked against his shoulder, and he came up fast when he heard her faster than a 61-year-old should have been able to, which confirmed what she had already assessed about him. He had a weapon in his left hand before he was fully upright. They stood 8 feet apart in the maintenance corridor, with weapons pointed at each other, and the only sounds were the building's mechanical systems doing their indifferent work. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You've been dead for 3 years," he said. His voice was flat, factual. He was not a man who wasted breath on theater. "I've been patient for 3 years," she said. "There's a difference." "You don't have a clear shot," he said. Shoulder. "You don't have a clear shot either," she said. "The angle to the panel behind you puts your backdrop in the recovery wing. You fire in this corridor, the round doesn't stop at me." He knew she was right. She could see it, the specific calculation of a man who had always managed risks by thinking 3 steps ahead, now 3 steps ahead, and not finding anything useful. "It's over," she said. She said it without triumph, because there was no triumph available in a maintenance corridor. At 2 in the morning, with 5 names in her head and a shoulder that was informing her, in precise physiological terms, that it had strong objections to the evening's activities. Solon is in custody. The facility is in federal hands. The drives are secured. Connolly, the building is locked down, and Kirby is 4 steps behind me. She paused. "Put it down." He looked at her for a long moment. 8 feet away, in the low light, with the breathing of 2 people who were both managing something significant. She watched his face. She was good at reading faces, had been good at it, long before the training made it systematic. And what she read in Connolly's face, in that corridor, was the sequence of a man reaching the end of a calculation, and finding that the sum was not what he had expected. He had expected, she thought, to have more options. Men who had operated at his level for as long as he had developed a specific confidence in the availability of options, the belief, built over years of successful navigation, that there was always another move. That confidence was a resource, and she was watching it run out. His weapon hand lowered by 3 degrees, then 6. Then he set it on the ground of the maintenance corridor and stood with his hands at his sides, and something went out of his posture that had been there a moment before the kinetic readiness. The managed intensity of a man still inside an operation. Kirby came past her and had Connolly in cuffs in 15 seconds. Adrian lowered her weapon. Her shoulder told her it had opinions about how long she had been holding that position, and she accepted the opinions without comment. She looked at Connolly at the side of his face, at the gray in his hair, at the ordinary human appearance of a man who had made an extraordinary decision 3 years and 8 months ago in an office somewhere, and signed something that put her team into a prepared ambush. She had imagined this moment. Not often she was not a person who spent significant energy on imagined futures, because imagined futures were a distraction from the operational present. But she had imagined it. She had thought about what she would say, what she would feel, what the adequate response was to standing in front of the person responsible. She didn't say anything, not because she had nothing to say, because everything she might have said, every indictment, every accounting, every naming of what he had done was already in the building behind her, documented, evidenced, in federal custody, being processed by people whose job is to translate it into the specific institutional language of consequence. Whatever she said in this corridor would be less than what the evidence said, and the evidence would speak for years, in courtrooms and in records, and in the specific public permanence of federal prosecution, in a voice that was considerably more durable than anything she could produce at 2 in the morning in a maintenance corridor with one working arm. She stepped back and let Kirby take him out of the corridor. She stood alone in the maintenance spine for a moment, in the mechanical hum of the building, and she breathed. Victor Malloy woke up 41 hours later. Adrian was not in the room when it happened. She was in a debrief session with Pruitt and 2 additional federal officials whose titles suggested they had come from significantly higher up the chain than anyone who had been involved in the previous 36 hours. The debrief was thorough in the way that debriefs were when the situation being debriefed had implications that reached into the senior levels of federal intelligence infrastructure. She was honest in it. She gave them everything: the 14 months, the surveillance methodology, the transaction records, the reasoning behind her decisions at each stage. She did not apologize for operating unsanctioned, because she had already decided that an apology required a belief that the alternative would have been better, and she did not have that belief. She acknowledged the legal and procedural complications of her situation with the same directness she would have applied to a clinical assessment. Here is what is true. Here are the implications. Here is what I recommend we do about it. Pruitt was, she had decided, a man she could work with. He was thorough, and he was fair, and he did not perform either of those qualities. He just was them, with the quiet durability of someone who had been doing this long enough to have filtered out the performance. At the end of the second day of debriefs, he sat across from her in the small room with the parking lot window and said, "Stop. There is going to be a process regarding your status. The KIA listing, the false identity, the period of unsanctioned operation. It is going to involve people who have institutional reasons to be uncomfortable with how this unfolded. And it is not going to be resolved quickly." "I know," she said. "I want to be clear about what I can and cannot tell you at this stage," he said. "I cannot tell you the outcome. I can tell you that the evidence you produced and the asset you protected and the network you helped us dismantle represent the most significant counterintelligence success this task force has had, and that those facts will be present in every conversation about your status." She nodded. "I can also tell you," Pruitt said, with the careful deliberateness of someone delivering a message that had been thought about before this meeting, that the military record of Captain Adrian Voss and the operational record of what happened 3 years and 8 months ago, and the names of the 5 personnel lost in that operation, all of that is going to be reviewed formally, with the specific intent of ensuring the official record accurately reflects what occurred. She was quiet for a moment. "Their families," she said. "Will be notified," he said, and briefed, as much as can be shared. She looked at the parking lot through the window. Gray afternoon light on gray asphalt, the ordinary visual vocabulary of institutional settings, indifferent and functional. Dana Pruitt, Marco Llewellyn, Tobias Ragg, Felicia Barron, James Holt. They would be named. The record would be corrected. The specific lie of the official account, non-hostile incident, clean casualty report, no acknowledgement of the betrayal that had put them there, would be replaced by the truth, which was less clean and more permanent. It was not enough. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough, because enough was not a thing available in this category of debt. But it was real, and it was documented, and it would last. "Okay," she said. Warren Connolly was arrested and charged on 17 counts across 4 federal statutes: espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and obstruction of federal investigations, among others. The arraignment was public in the sense that arraignments were public, and the charges were specific in the sense that specific charges have a weight that general accusations do not. His name appeared in the federal docket with the unmistakable permanence of a legal record, which is the most honest kind of permanence there is. It does not depend on anyone's memory, goodwill, or continued attention. It simply exists. Garrett Solon entered a cooperation agreement 14 days after his arrest. The agreement was extensive, and the information he provided extended the investigation into adjacent networks and relationships that had been peripheral until his cooperation made them central. The cooperation did not spare him. Consequence cooperation agreements in federal espionage cases did not work that way, but it changed the shape of his future in ways that were significant and not, from any angle she could find, satisfying to contemplate. Satisfying was not, she had decided, the appropriate standard. The appropriate standard was accurate. Were the facts correctly represented? Were the consequences proportionate to the actions? Was the record an honest account of what had happened? By those measures, the outcome was adequate. Not clean, nothing was clean, but adequate. The Harrow Group's Caldwell logistics operation was dismantled over the following 3 weeks, and the wider network that Connolly and Solon had been protecting took longer 6 months of federal case building that she followed from a distance through channels. She was now cautiously and provisionally allowed to access again. The 4 drives recovered from the facility contained active deployment data for 11 ongoing operations. All 11 were stood down and restructured before the exposure could be exploited. The personnel involved were relocated, and their cover identities replaced an enormous, grinding, expensive process that nobody publicized because publicizing it would require explaining why it was necessary. Victor Malloy was told when he was well enough to be told the broad outlines of what had happened. He was told by Kirby in the federal medical facility, in the room where he had spent 6 days recovering from a surgical repair that had saved his life partly because a nurse in a Caldwell trauma bay had kept him alive long enough to get there. He asked to see her. She came to the facility on the afternoon, 3 months after the night in the warehouse with her shoulder in a proper sling that she was supposed to be wearing more consistently than she was. She sat in the chair beside bed, a different chair, deeper in a different room, but the same general posture she had maintained across that first long night when she had watched his monitors and his chest rise and fall and thought about the people she had not been able to keep alive. He was bigger awake than he had looked unconscious, which was the case with most people, but more pronounced with him. He had the specific alertness of someone whose body had been through significant insult and was in the process of compiling a full damage assessment. He looked at her for a moment. "They told me what you did," he said. "In the trauma bay. You would have managed," she said. "I would have been dead in about a minute," he said. Not dramatically, just accurately. "Probably," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your team," he said. He said it the way people with field experience said things like that directly, without decoration, understanding that decoration was a kind of disrespect. She looked at the window. "So, am I. Kirby says the record's being corrected. That's what they tell me. Do you believe them?" She thought about it honestly. "I believe Pruitt," she said. "I think Pruitt is the kind of person who means what he says and has enough institutional standing to make it happen. The rest of the chain," she paused. "Institutions correct their records when the cost of not correcting them exceeds the cost of correction. The cost calculation right now favors correction." Malloy looked at her with the assessment of someone who had spent years evaluating people in conditions where being wrong was expensive. "What are you going to do?" he said. It was the question she had been living inside for 3 weeks, not anxiously, but steadily, the way you live inside. A question that doesn't have a cheap answer. "There's a process," she said. "For my status. It'll take time. After the process." She looked at her hands, at the hands that had found an arterial bleed in the dark, by touch, that had built a 14-month surveillance record from nothing, that had held a man against a wall in a recovery room, and stripped a weapon in a maintenance corridor and strapped wounds for people who needed it. I don't know yet, she said, but I know what I'm good at. He nodded. The nod of someone who understood that this was a complete answer. The formal restoration of Captain Adrian Voss's military record took 4 months and generated a quantity of paperwork that was, in its own way, a monument to the bureaucratic complexity of correcting an official lie. The KIA designation was formally vacated. The operational record of the mission, classified at a level that meant most of the details would not be public in her lifetime, was corrected to reflect what had actually occurred. Professionally, the 5 personnel lost were formally recognized, with the specific language that distinguished combat loss left from the accident designation that had been applied to protect the people responsible. The families were notified privately. She was present notified privately. It was not her place to be. It was not her for understood. And she understood that, but she was told they had occurred, and she held that knowledge in the part of herself that had been holding those 5 names for 3 years and 8 months, and she let it do what it did, which was complicated and not entirely resolvable, and also not required to be. Some things did not resolve. That was not failure. That was the honest texture of real outcomes as opposed to imagined ones. Dr. Leonard Foss, who had ordered her away from a bedside, and whose order she had not followed, submitted an incident to the hospital's credentialing board 3 days after the federal investigation became public knowledge through the Connolly arraignment. The incident report cited her intervention in the trauma resuscitation. It was not a complaint. It was the specific kind of documentation that a careful man produces when he understands that his previous framing of a situation was wrong and wants the record to reflect a revised assessment. She read the report, which Kirby sent her as an attachment, without comment. In it, Foss described what she had done as demonstrating clinical competence significantly beyond standard nursing scope. He had written, in the particular formal language of medical documentation, that the intervention had been decisive and that the patient's survival was directly attributable to it. He had written this in a document that would be part of her professional record. She thought about the way he had said, "Get her out of here." About the specific quality of dismissal that carried no malice, the most common kind, the kind built entirely out of assumption rather than intent. He had looked at a badge that said nurse and sent a face that said unremarkable and had done the most ordinary thing available. He had seen what he expected to see and stopped looking. She did not blame him for it. She had, in fact, been counting on it. The assumption that quiet meant small, that ordinary appearance meant ordinary capacity, that the person who did not announce themselves was not worth attending to. She had spent 14 months living inside that assumption and using it as a tool. The Trauma Bay version of it had cost him something. What it cost the people who had been running a criminal network in a Rust Belt city for years, who had looked at the same badge and the same face and the same apparent unremarkability and had made the same calculation, was considerably more. There was something honest in that. Not a lesson that resolved into a clean moral, because nothing in her experience had ever resolved into a clean moral, but an observation with some weight to it. The people who most needed to be underestimated understood long before the people doing the underestimating what that underestimation cost. She went back to Hargrove Medical Center on a Wednesday morning in November, 4 months after Victor Malloy had come through the bay doors barely alive. She was not Nora Walsh anymore. That identity had been formally closed with the federal investigation's documentation. She was Captain Adrian Voss, which was her name, which felt strange in her own mouth after 14 months of not saying it and 37 years of being it. She was navigating a provisional status with the military and the federal task force that had not yet arrived at a permanent configuration, which was uncomfortable and also manageable, because she had been navigating configurations that had not yet arrived at permanent for most of her adult life. She had not been invited to come back to Hargrove. She had made no arrangements. She simply came on a Wednesday morning, because the process had reached a stage where she had days without specific requirements, and she understood something about herself that the 14 months had clarified. She did not do well with days without specific requirements. The charge nurse at the level 2 desk looked up when she came through. "Captain Voss," the charge nurse said, and then stopped, because she had practiced that, and it still sounded strange coming out, and they both knew it. "Just Adrian is fine," she said. The trauma bay was quiet. At 9 in the morning, the bad hours were the middle of the night and the weekend afternoons and the specific windows around holidays, when people made decisions they regretted. At 9 on a Wednesday, it had the stripped-down readiness of a room between events. Dr. Osi was at the board, reviewing the morning's cases. He looked up when she came through. He had the expression of someone who had followed the public elements of a federal fence station with significant personal interest and had spent time revising his understanding of events he had witnessed directly. It was a specific expression, and she had seen versions of it on several people over the past 4 months, the look of someone recalibrating in real time, updating a model of a situation that had turned out to be larger and more complicated than its visible surface had suggested. "You came back," he said. "I'm not sure in what capacity yet," she said. "That's being worked out. But you came back." She looked at the trauma bay, at the supply cart where she had found a Foley catheter and a syringe on a night when everything had depended on those items being available and on someone knowing what to do with them. At the monitors, the beds, the controlled Cheo's infrastructure of a room designed to hold the line between alive and not. "This is what I'm good at," she said. Osi looked at her for a moment. He was young enough that he still believed the world was susceptible to the kind of honesty that named things directly, and old enough in his training that he was beginning to understand the cost of that belief. "Yeah," he said, "it is." She picked up a chart from the board, the overnight case that hadn't yet been fully reviewed. A post-op patient on level 3 who needed a medication reconciliation and a wound check. And she read it with the focused attentions of someone for whom a chart was not paperwork, but a person described in clinical language, which was always a translation, always incomplete, always worth reading carefully. She put the chart under her arm and walked toward the elevator. Behind her, the trauma bay waited in its readiness, clean and equipped and indifferent to the history of the room, as it always was, as all rooms where the history lived in the people, not the walls. And the people moved through and changed and carried what they carried, and the rooms simply held the space for whatever came next. She had been dismissed, she had been underestimated and discounted and officially erased. She had been the person in the room that nobody looked at, by design and by necessity and eventually by choice, because she had understood something that took most people a long time to learn, that being seen was not the same as having power, and that having power was not the same as being loud, and that the most dangerous person in any room was often the one that everyone had already decided they knew. She was not the same person she had been before the drainage channel and the 9 days and the 14 months of patience. She was not unbroken. She had never particularly been broken, but she had been changed in the specific way that a person is changed by carrying something heavy for a long time in a direction that matters. The change was not dramatic. It did not look like anything in particular from the outside. From the inside, it felt like knowing exactly where she was. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The door closed behind her, and she stood with the chart under her arm and her shoulder in its sling, going up toward the ward and the patient and the work. And she thought about 5 names, and she thought about a drainage channel, and she thought about a trauma bay at 11:47 at night, and the specific quality of a room full of people who had already decided what she was. She had let them decide, and then she had gone ahead and been exactly what she was, regardless of what anyone had decided. That was the only way she knew how to do it. It was not a philosophy or a posture or a lesson she had extracted from her experience. It was simply the thing that was true about her that she would do the work in front of her with everything she had, whether or not anyone in the room was paying attention. The elevator stopped. The door opened. She walked out into the ward and went to work.